Israelites finally crossed the Jordan River. Joshua was the new leader, and after wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years, they finally cross over. And their troubles with the natives, the locals that live in Canaan, are just beginning. And so Joshua was really all about the battles that the Israelites go through. There's a couple of big battles mentioned in that book. The story of Jericho, which is a really great story where God does all the fighting. The Israelites just had to do a few things they were told to, go around Jericho, blowing some trumpets. There's some other battles where Israel did not do what God told them to do, and that didn't turn out so well. And they had to get their act together. But ultimately, in the book of Joshua, the Israelites take the land for the most part, and they divide it up amongst the 12 tribes. So that's really Joshua, so we'll hear that one. The next book is Judges. So as we've seen, the sort of the grand arc of the Old Testament really captures human nature. And so you see always the Israelites, they do pretty well, and then they go the other way. And so the book of Judges is it's sort of like, it's kind of similar to some of the other sections we've seen in some of the previous books, but where the Israelites just turn away from God practically. And it's pretty bad. Like Judges is pretty bad. There's kind of 6 different cycles of the Israelites' failings, if you will. And there are 6 main judges that are presented there. Gideon and Samson are in the book of Judges. When I was a kid, I always thought, when you first hear the story, Samson presented by your Sunday morning Sunday school teacher, I always thought Samson was a good guy when I was a kid. And he was maybe in a few ways, but Samson was not such a great guy, actually, when you look at him. I've heard him described as maybe a picture of the carnal Christian. And Samson had a lot of gifts he was blessed with, great strength and maybe some wisdom as well. But he didn't really use those gifts too well. He was a bit self-indulgent, had a thing for the ladies, and got himself in all kinds of trouble. And his story didn't turn out too well either. So there's this period of time. At the end of that, we'll talk about, there's mentioned several times in Judges, there's kind of one sentence that's said a few times, kind of describes how the Israelites were then, and maybe a little bit in our day as well. So that'll be Judges, and then we get a little bit of relief from the downward spiral of the Israelites with the book of Ruth, which is, you probably heard people say that God is hardly mentioned in that particular book. But it's a beautiful story. I guess I can't read Hebrew, but apparently if you know how to read Hebrew, it's a literary masterpiece. There's a few other books in the Old Testament that are like that, but it's very well written in the Hebrew language. And it's kind of the story of God's providence and how things are going on in sort of daily activities, daily problems that people are having, but God's behind the scenes. And you kind of, at the very end of the book, you sort of get the punchline, and there's something special about Ruth and her family that we'll find out later. So anybody have any preliminary comments before we jump into the video? No? Okay, so we're going to start with Joshua. So I should mention these are sort of like I don't know. Nowadays it probably would be like PG-13, I guess. I don't know, but maybe worse than that. The things that happen, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of bloodshed in both Joshua and Judges, and a lot of this was at the direction of God. God wanted the Canaanites wiped out, and so there's a lot of people make a big deal about that and say that God he must not be a very nice God. But there's some reasons, but it is disturbing, to see what was happening And the Canaanites were some pretty rotten guys, if you look up about them. But anyway, maybe we can talk about it a little bit more if we have a couple minutes left at the end here. So, Jerry, let it roll.
The book of Joshua. Let's back up and remember the story so far. So God chose Abraham, and then his family became the people of Israel, who are then enslaved down in Egypt. And so through Moses, God rescued Israel out of Egypt. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, and he brought them through the wilderness. So Israel then camped outside the promised land, and Moses called them to obey God's commands so that they could show all the other nations what God is like. The book of Joshua picks up right after Moses has died, and Israel's ready to enter the land. So the story of Joshua is designed with four main movements. Joshua first leads Israel into the promised land, and then once they're there, they meet all this hostility from the Canaanites, and so they engage them in battle. Then after their victories, Joshua divides up the promised land as the inheritance for the 12 tribes, and then the book concludes with these final speeches that Joshua gives to the people. So let's dive in and we'll see how all of it flows together. The first section begins with Moses' death, and Joshua is appointed as Israel's new leader. And the author intentionally presents Joshua as a new Moses. So like Moses, Joshua calls the people to obey the Torah, which means the covenant commands that they were given at Mount Sinai. And then Joshua sends spies into the land, just as Moses did back in Numbers chapters 13 and 14, except it goes way better this time. In fact, even some Canaanites turn and follow the God of Israel. Joshua then leads all Israel across the Jordan River and into the land. Just like the sea parted for Moses in the Exodus, so here the river Jordan parts and the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant across, leading all Israel with them. Now, in chapter 5, the story transitions. So the people look back to their roots as God's covenant people, and so the new generation is circumcised and they celebrate their first Passover in the land. But then they turn and prepare to go forward. And Joshua has this crazy encounter with a mysterious warrior, who, it turns out, is the angelic commander of God's army. And Joshua asks, "Are you for us, or are you for our enemies?" And the warrior responds, "Neither," which shows that the real question here is whether Joshua is on God's side. It makes clear that this whole story is not about Israel versus the Canaanites. Rather, this is God's battle, and Israel is going to play the role of spectators or sometimes supporters in God's plan, which leads to the next section. We find stories about all these conflicts that Israel had with different Canaanite groups. And the first part retells the story of two battles in detail, and that's followed by a series of short stories that condense years of battles into a few brief summaries. So the first two battles are against Jericho and then Ai. And they offer these contrasting portraits of God's faithfulness versus Israel's failure. At Jericho, Israel is to take a completely passive approach. So they let God's presence in the ark lead them around the city to music for 6 days. And just like Rahab turned to the God of Israel, maybe the people of Jericho would do the same, but they don't. And so on the 7th day, the priests blow the trumpets and the walls come falling down, leading Israel to victory. The point of the story is that God is the one who will deliver his people. Israel simply needs to trust and wait. Now, the next story of the battle at Ai makes the opposite point. So there's this Israelite named Achan, and he steals from Jericho some of the devoted goods that were to belong to God alone, and then he lies about it. It's a pretty lame move after all that God has done for Israel. And so Israel goes into battle with the city of Ai, and they're totally defeated. And it's only after humble repentance and severely dealing with Achan's sin that Israel gains victory. And so together, these two stories, they're placed right up front to make an important point. If Israel is going to inherit the land, they have to be obedient and trust in God's commands. They don't get special treatment. Now, the second part of this section begins with the Gibeonites, a Canaanite people group, and they do just what Rahab did as they turn to follow the God of Israel and they make peace with Israel. This is in contrast to all of these other Canaanite kings who start to form alliances and coalitions, and they want to destroy Israel. So Israel engages them in battle, and they win by a landslide. And so this whole section concludes with this summary list of all of these victories won by Moses and then by Joshua. Now, let's stop for a second, because odds are that these stories and the violence in them, they're going to bother you. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you're bound to wonder, like, didn't Jesus say to love your enemies? Why is God declaring war here? So first, why the Canaanites? The main reasons are actually given earlier in the biblical story. It's that the culture of the Canaanites had become extremely morally corrupt, especially when it comes to sex. Go check out Leviticus chapter 18. And they also widely practiced child sacrifice. Go see Deuteronomy chapter 12. And so God didn't want these practices to influence Israel. The Canaanites had to go. Which raises the second question. Did God actually command the destruction of all the Canaanites, like a genocide? So at first glance, you look at the phrases used in these stories. They totally destroyed them. They left no survivor or anything to breathe. But when you look a second time, more closely, you'll see that these phrases are clearly hyperbole and not literal. So go back to the original command about the Canaanites in Deuteronomy chapter 7. Israel is first told to drive out the Canaanites, but then to totally destroy them. And then that's followed by commands to not intermarry with them or enter into business deals with them. So you can't marry someone that you've destroyed. I think you get the point. The same idea applies to the stories in Joshua. Look closely. So for example, we're told in Joshua chapter 10 that Israel left no survivors in the cities of Hebron or Debir. But then later, in chapter 15, we see these towns and they're still populated by Canaanites. And so what we're seeing is that Joshua fits in with other ancient battle accounts by using non-literal hyperbolic language as part of the narrative style. And so the word genocide doesn't actually fit what we see here, especially in light of the stories about the Canaanites who did turn to the God of Israel, like Rahab or the Gibeonites. God was open to those who would turn to him. The last thing to think about is that these stories mark a unique moment in Israel's history. These battles were limited to the handful of people groups living in the land of Canaan. With all other nations, Israel was commanded by God to pursue peace. Go read Deuteronomy chapter 20. And so the purpose of these battle stories was never to tell you, the reader, to go commit violence in God's name. Rather, they show God bringing his justice on human evil at a unique moment in history and how he delivered Israel from being annihilated by the Canaanites. Now, let's go back to the book's design. After years of battles, we see an aging Joshua, and he starts dividing up the land for the 12 tribes of Israel. And most of this section is like lists of boundary lines. And let's be honest, it's kind of boring. It's like reading a map that has no pictures. But for the Israelites, these lists were super important. This was the fulfillment of God's ancient promises to Abraham, that his descendants would inherit the promised land. And so now it was all coming to pass right down to the detail, which leads to the final section. Joshua gives two speeches to the people. They're very similar to the final speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy. Joshua reminds them of God's generosity, how he brought them into the land and rescued them from the Canaanites. And so he calls them to turn away from the Canaanite gods and be faithful to the covenant they made. If they do, it will lead to life and blessing in the land. But if they're unfaithful, Israel will call down on itself the same divine judgment that the Canaanites experienced. They'll be kicked off the land into exile. And so Joshua leaves Israel with a choice. What is Israel going to do? That's the big question that looms as the story ends, and that's the book of Joshua. The book of Judges. So remember, after Joshua led the tribes of Israel into the promised land, he called them to be faithful to their covenant with God by obeying the commands of the Torah. And if they do this, they will show all the other nations what God is like. So Judges begins with the death of Joshua and basically tells the story of Israel's total failure. The book's name comes from the type of leaders Israel had in this period. Before they had any kings, the tribes were all governed by these judges. Now, don't think of a courtroom. These were regional political military leaders, more like a tribal chieftain. And you need to be warned, the book of Judges is very disturbing and violent. It tells the tragic tale of Israel's moral corruption, of its bad leadership, and basically how they become no different than the Canaanites. But this sad story is also meant to generate hope for the future, and you can see this in how the book's designed. There's a large introduction that sets the stage for Israel's failure as they don't drive out the remaining Canaanites. Then the large main section of the book has stories about the growing corruption of Israel's judges, and the progression here shows how Israel's leaders go from pretty good to okay to bad to worse. The concluding section is really disturbing and shows the corruption of the people of Israel as a whole. So let's dive in, and we can explore each part a bit more. The opening section begins with the tribes of Israel in their territories in the Promised Land. And while Joshua defeated some key Canaanite towns, there was still a lot of land to be taken and lots of Canaanites living in those areas. And so chapter 1 gives a long list of Canaanite groups and towns that Israel just failed to drive out from the land. Now, remember, the whole point of driving out the Canaanites was to avoid their moral corruption and their way of worshiping the gods through child sacrifice. God had called Israel to be a holy people, and that does not happen. Chapter 2 describes how Israel just moved in alongside the Canaanites and adopted all their cultural and religious practices. And it's right here that the story stops. For nearly a whole chapter, the narrator gives us an overview of everything that's about to happen in the body of the book. This part of Israel's history, the narrator says, was a series of cycles moving in a downward spiral. So Israel became like the Canaanites, and so they would sin against God. So God would allow them to be conquered and oppressed by the Canaanites, and eventually the Israelites would see the error of their ways and repent. So God would raise up a deliverer, a judge from among Israel who would defeat the enemy and bring about an era of peace. But eventually Israel would sin again, and it would all start over. This cycle provides the literary design and flow for the next main section of the book. It gets repeated for each of the 6 main judges whose stories are told here. Now, the stories of the first 3 judges, Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah, they are epic adventures. They're also extremely bloody stories. Either the judge themselves or people who help the judge, they defeat their enemies and deliver the people of Israel. The stories about the next 3 judges are longer, and they focus in on the character flaws of the judges, which get increasingly worse. So Gideon, he begins pretty well. He's a coward of a man, but he eventually comes to trust that God can save Israel through him. And so he defeats a huge army of Midianites with only 300 men carrying torches and clay pots. But Gideon has a nasty temper, and he murders a bunch of fellow Israelites for not helping him in his battle. And then it all goes downhill from there. He makes an idol from the gold that he won in his battles. And then after he dies, all Israel worships the idol as a god, and the cycle begins again. The next main judge is Jephthah, who's something of a mafia thug living up in the hills. And when things get really bad for Israel, the elders come to him begging for his help. And Jephthah was a very effective leader. He won lots of battles against the Ammonites, but he was so unfamiliar with the God of Israel, he treats him like a Canaanite god. He vows to sacrifice his daughter if he wins the battle. This tragic story, it shows just how far Israel has fallen. They no longer know the character of their own God, which leads to murder and to false worship. The last judge, Samson, is by far the worst. His life began full of promise, but he has no regard for the God of Israel. He was promiscuous, violent, and arrogant. He did win brutally strategic victories over the Philistines, but only at the expense of his own integrity, and his life ends in a violent rush of mass murder. Now, a quick note here. You'll notice a repeated theme in the main section of the book, that at key moments, God's Spirit will empower each of these judges to accomplish these great acts of deliverance. Now, the fact that God uses these really screwed up people doesn't mean he endorses all or even any of their decisions. God is committed first and foremost to saving his people, but all he has to work with is these corrupt leaders. And so work with them he does. This whole section is designed to show just how bad things have gotten. You can't even tell the Israelites and the Canaanites apart anymore, and that's just the leaders. The final section shows Israel as a whole hitting bottom. There are 2 tragic stories here, and they are not for the faint of heart. They're structured by this key line that gets repeated 4 times at the close of the book. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The first story is about an Israelite named Micah who builds a private temple to an idol, and that gets plundered by a private army sent from the tribe of Dan. So they come and they steal everything, and then they go and burn down the peaceful city of Laish and murder all of its inhabitants. It's a horrifying story. When Israel forgets its God, might makes right. The final story of the book is even worse. It's a shocking tale of sexual abuse and violence, which all leads to Israel's first civil war. It's very disturbing. And that's the point. These stories are meant to serve as a warning. Israel's descent into self-destruction is the result of turning away from the God who loves them and saved them out of slavery in Egypt. And now Israel needs to be delivered again from themselves. The only glimmer of hope in this story is found in this repeated line in the last part of the book. It actually forms the last sentence of the story. Israel has no king. And so the stage is set for the following books to tell the origins of King David's family, the book of Ruth, and also the origins of kingship itself in Israel, the book of 1 Samuel. But the story of Judges has value as a tragedy. It's a sobering explanation of the human condition, and ultimately it points out the need for God's grace to send a king who will rescue his people. And that's the book of Judges. The book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are 3 main characters in the book: Naomi the widow, Ruth the Moabite, and Boaz the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line: "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi. And she says, "Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." And so the 2 of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her, that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel, where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, It was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up, and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman in Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future. And that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz. And each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Obed, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
Thanks, Jerry. Okay, we just have a few minutes here, maybe 5 minutes. So one thing I just wanted to, before we talk specifically about the 3 different books, one of the things you may not have thought about much, but it's kind of one of the bedrock ideas for apologetics. What I mean by that is evidences for the truth or the divine nature of our scriptures. Do you think if you were going to make up a religion Would you put stories like this in there for your followers? There are many what are known as, I guess, embarrassing stories, right, Sandy? You looked at that a little bit before. And so these stories of real people doing terrible things or embarrassing things, and it's found in the New Testament as well. If you were going to make up something, make up a new religion, or try to get followers, you probably wouldn't paint the picture that we see in some of the, especially in some of these Old Testament stories. So just a little side note there. But anybody ever heard that before? There's a bunch of different reasons why we think the Scriptures are true. But
you see that in the New Testament where Paul talks about if Christ wasn't raised from the dead,
yeah, we're the most
pitiful.
Yeah, we're most pitiful.
And that's the whole Christian religion is based on Christ's death.
That's right.
And his resurrection.
Yeah, and who saw it first? Who were the first witnesses to that?
The women.
The women, right? And what was a woman's testimony in that culture worth?
Not much.
Not much. Yeah, it was not as valuable as a man's testimony. I think you had to have 2 or 3 women was equal to one man's testimony, something like that. So yeah, there's a bunch of other stuff like that. So if you were just trying to make up something, you probably wouldn't have this. There's a lot of Jewish rabbis and things that talk about this as well. Okay, so one other thing I want to point out in Joshua that I would take exception with a little bit with the narrator here, when he was talking about this idea of the Canaanites being wiped out and annihilated. That's what God did tell him to do that. So he kind of makes this case that was kind of an exaggeration, and there are language devices in the Old and New Testament where it is probably a little bit of exaggeration or trying to make a point in an exaggerated way, but I'm not sure this is one of them, personally. So maybe his case is I see what he's saying, but he's saying, well, there's still Canaanites left, so they must not have wiped them out. I think there were Canaanites left because the Israelites didn't do what they were supposed to do. We saw that with Saul, and I just read a quick passage here. In Deuteronomy 20, God gave the reason why he wanted this. And they didn't do it all the time. They didn't wipe out. They usually would keep the women and children, sometimes the cattle, that type of thing. And that was kind of a typical cultural thing throughout that region. And they often offered a chance to surrender first also. That was another thing. But in the case of the Canaanites, God gave some specific instructions. But God told them in Deuteronomy 20, the reason for that, right after he told them to do that, to wipe them out. Otherwise, they will teach, the Canaanites in this case, otherwise they will teach you to follow all the detestable things that they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. And that's exactly what happened. So I think, of course God knows the future, but again, I think there's free will involved here. So I'm not so sure that was hyperbole in the case where they were, where God asked them to do something and they didn't do it. But I get it. That seems very harsh, right? To wipe out every living, breathing thing. But there's a lot of imagery in Judges and Joshua and other places in the Old Testament, of course, where they use the term the land was defiled, and so it was so bad. They're murdering their own children on flaming altars. And that was just one of the things. They were brutal people. They had a long time to repent, and so God was just dealing with it. So it could be the way he said it, or it could be that they just didn't do what they were supposed to do. Any thoughts?
Yeah, it does seem like if we didn't hear all these stories, how bad man was at that time, with all these different religions they come up with, it could happen today, but it doesn't because we have laws. You think about all the terrible things like sacrificing children and the things that
we've killed
very much against God.
Yeah, how many millions of babies have been killed in this country before they're even born? So that, It's a scary read because we can align a little bit of these things. Kind of jumping to Judges, he mentioned, it says it 4 times, it actually ends the book. In those days, Israel had no king, everyone did as they saw fit. So they didn't have any, you couldn't call the police. They didn't have the law and order.
No courage.
Yeah, no, I'm saying they didn't really have law and order, and everyone did what was right in their own, as they saw fit. And I think if we didn't have, it's a known fact, if you take the police out of the city, or how about just the lights go out? The lights go out, you have a power failure. What has happened many times in big cities? What happens?
Take over.
Yeah, they burn the place down, right? People come out and they loot and destroy. So that's human nature. So as terrible as these things sound, we're 5 minutes from that being able to happen. And look at some of this stuff that's been happening in Gaza or the Middle East. This is not like it's not like we're more civilized than these guys were. Garth.
Yeah. When I talk to people who have doubts about religion, and all in the authenticity of things, one of the things they have a very difficult time with is God saying, destroy everybody.
Yep.
And his point about there being hyperboles, it sort of is an answer.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you look at Saul and destroy all the Amalekites, but yet God said, hey, I hear, and things like that. And so it's, I think it's a worthy study, about that, because, and then if God said to destroy these people because, their religion will corrupt you, etc., why wouldn't he be saying that today to us? Maybe about Muslims or...
Yeah. The narrator mentioned that this was a specific time and specific circumstances. So we see, God is love, right? God is love. So, but God is not, love is not acceptance or approval of things either. So there are circumstances where you can see where God, he reaches a limit, and God is perfectly just and perfectly merciful. But it is a hard thing to get over, right? If you're just seeing this for the first time. And so I think what I would say is God did give many chances. That's how I kind of think. But I think he gives people many, and in fact nations, many chances to change their ways. And at some point, their time is up.
Yeah, that's the thing. What you just said. Obviously God's time is not our time. Well, we think that some things that people get away with, or religions get away with, but it's not our time. We're thinking God's time is different. He's got a reasoning for where he waits, and there takes over. The way I see it anyway.
Yeah, it is a really good study. As Garth mentioned, there's a whole bunch of things you got to get into. What's is physical death? Is that the worst thing that can happen to you? God, he did directly kill some people. And he is the author of life, and so really he's the only one who can give and take life, without sinning, if you will, because he doesn't sin. But he is the sovereign of the universe, and so there's a lot of things about that. When God killed somebody in the Old Testament, there's a few cases you can see where he did exactly with lightning, not really, but they ended up like Moses is an example. Maybe Moses, it's kind of hard to tell if he died a natural death if you read the account. Yet he is clearly with God. He meets Jesus right later on the Mount of Transfiguration. So. Physical death is not the end; it's a transition. So there could be some cases where there's a case where maybe a temporary physical punishment, but not an eternal physical punishment, because God was still using people. So that's a big study. So we're almost out of time, but So I think when we got the gist of the cycle that the Israelites went through, yeah.
I know you're about out of time. Did Samson come back to the Lord?
Great question. Yeah, so that's one of the ones. So Samson,
he prayed.
He prayed.
It was
He probably repented. I mean, you can sort of detect that in the story. Did God want him to do mass murder, as the way the narrator described it in the video? But these were the enemies of God that he killed. And again, the physical, there's the physical world and the spiritual world. Samson was probably carrying out God's will to take out some more bad people here, if you want to think of it that way. But yeah, I kind of think he did maybe come to his senses a little bit. But he was a very arrogant guy, right? So it took a lot to get him to repent, maybe.
I sort of, the correlation maybe with Judas. See, I'm not, I was always raised that Judas went to hell.